Today we explore a powerful psychological turning point, the moment when the empath walks away and the narcissist is left alone with something he has avoided his entire life, his own inner world. To understand this moment, we must first understand emotional dependency. There are individuals who build their identity from within, through reflection, empathy, and self-awareness. And there are others who construct identity from external reactions. Approval becomes oxygen. Attention becomes fuel. Control becomes stability. When someone relies heavily on external validation, they are not strengthening the self. They are outsourcing it. Emotional intelligence teaches us that true stability comes from internal regulation, not external applause. The empath, by nature, feels deeply, reflects deeply, and connects deeply. But empaths also grow, and growth brings awareness. Awareness brings boundaries. And boundaries change dynamics. When an empath walks away, it is rarely impulsive. It is usually the result of deep reflection. It is the realization that compassion without reciprocity becomes self-abandonment. Now, here is where the psychological shift occurs. When emotional supply disappears, the narcissistic personality encounters silence. And silence is reflective. Without constant reassurance, without admiration, without emotional reaction to control, the external mirrors vanish. What remains is unfiltered self-perception. This is the darkness. Darkness, in this sense, is not evil. It is unexamined insecurity. It is unresolved shame. It is fear of inadequacy buried beneath grandiosity. Many individuals who display narcissistic traits have built protective layers over early wounds, wounds of rejection, invisibility, or conditional love. The ego becomes armor. Superiority becomes defense. Control becomes safety. But when the empath walks away, the armor cracks. Why? Because the empath did more than provide attention. The empath provided reflection. They mirrored emotions. They absorbed storms. They stabilized chaos. When that stabilizing presence leaves, emotional dysregulation rises. Anger may surface first. Blame may follow. But beneath anger is exposure. This is the collapse of the false self. The false self is a performance, carefully maintained, constantly reinforced. It requires audience participation. Remove the audience, and the performance weakens. In psychological terms, this is ego destabilization. The constructed identity no longer receives validation, and the individual must confront a painful question: who am I without admiration? This confrontation feels like darkness because it challenges the very structure of identity. But here is the transformative truth. Darkness is not the end. It is the beginning of awareness. Emotional intelligence teaches us that growth begins at the point of discomfort. When defenses fall, insight becomes possible. When blame stops, responsibility begins. When projection ends, reflection starts. Not everyone chooses this path. Some double down on denial. Some seek new sources of validation. Some repeat cycles. But for those willing to face the silence, the departure of an empath becomes an awakening. Because when the empath walks away, what is removed is not just emotional supply, it is distraction. And without distraction, truth becomes visible. This is the moment where real strength can be born. Not the strength of dominance, but the strength of self-regulation. Not the power of control, but the power of accountability. Not superiority, but authenticity. The deeper lesson here is not about narcissists or empaths alone. It is about all of us. Where do we seek validation? Do we regulate ourselves? Or do we rely on others to stabilize our emotions? Are we building an authentic self or protecting a fragile one? The empath's departure symbolizes something universal. When external reinforcement leaves, internal truth rises. And meeting that truth requires courage. Because meeting your darkness means acknowledging insecurity without shame. It means accepting past wounds without hiding behind ego. It means understanding that vulnerability is not weakness. It is integration. In educational psychology, we understand that self-awareness is the foundation of emotional growth. Without it, patterns repeat. With it, transformation becomes possible. So the real message of this moment is not revenge. It is revelation. When the empath walks away, the narcissist meets his darkness. But darkness is simply unlit potential, and potential, when illuminated by awareness, becomes growth. The question is not whether darkness appears. The question is whether one chooses to face it. And in that choice, true emotional maturity is born. When the empath walks away, what truly begins is not a dramatic collapse on the outside, but a quiet psychological confrontation on the inside. For a personality that has relied heavily on external validation, admiration, and emotional reactions to maintain a stable sense of self, the sudden absence of that emotional mirror creates an internal vacuum. The empath was not merely a partner. They were a regulator, a reflector, and often an unconscious stabilizer of fragile self-esteem. Without that consistent reassurance and emotional responsiveness, unresolved insecurities that were once masked by control and superiority begin to surface. This experience can feel like darkness because it removes distraction and exposes the unexamined parts of the self: shame, fear of inadequacy, fear of abandonment, and a deeply rooted need to be seen as powerful or flawless. Psychologically, this moment represents ego destabilization. The constructed identity, built around performance and perception, weakens when there is no audience to affirm it. Emotional intelligence teaches us that when external reinforcement disappears, individuals are forced into one of two paths: defensiveness or self-reflection. Defensiveness may appear as anger, blame, or immediate replacement of the lost connection in order to avoid discomfort. Self-reflection, however, requires emotional courage. It demands the ability to tolerate discomfort without escaping it. The empath's withdrawal, therefore, is not simply a loss of attention. It is the removal of emotional insulation. In that silence, the individual must confront who they are without control, without admiration, and without someone absorbing their emotional volatility. This confrontation can either deepen denial or initiate growth. True transformation begins only when the darkness is understood, not as punishment, but as information signals, pointing toward unhealed wounds and unmet emotional needs. When faced consciously, this painful awareness can become the first step toward developing authentic self-worth, rather than depending on external validation to sustain identity. When emotional supply is removed, the internal impact is often far more destabilizing than it appears externally. For an individual who has structured their sense of identity around admiration, influence, and control, the absence of a deeply responsive partner creates psychological disorientation. The empath's presence once functioned as a steady emotional feedback system, absorbing projections, validating strengths, softening insecurities, and responding to subtle cues of distress. When that presence disappears, the external scaffolding that supported self-image weakens. This can trigger heightened anxiety, irritability, or impulsive attempts to regain control, because the nervous system has grown accustomed to regulation through another person rather than through internal stability. Emotional intelligence research emphasizes that people who depend heavily on external validation often struggle with self-soothing and reflective awareness. Without someone mirroring their worth back to them, unresolved doubts and suppressed vulnerabilities rise into consciousness. The experience feels like darkness, not because something new has appeared, but because what was hidden is now visible. The mind may initially respond with blame or denial to protect the ego from discomfort, yet beneath those reactions lies exposure, the realization that self-confidence was conditional and relational. Wraith are then grounded and secure. This is a pivotal psychological crossroads. One direction leads toward defensiveness, distraction, and the pursuit of new sources of validation to quickly restore equilibrium. The other direction leads toward introspection and emotional development. Facing internal emptiness requires tolerance for discomfort and the willingness to question long-held narratives about superiority or entitlement. Growth begins when the individual recognizes that dependence on admiration is not strength but avoidance of deeper insecurity. In this way, the removal of emotional supply becomes an unintentional intervention. It interrupts habitual patterns and creates space for awareness. If embraced, this space can foster authentic self-worth, built from accountability, emotional regulation, and genuine self-understanding, rather than from the fleeting reinforcement of external praise. The collapse of the false self is rarely dramatic in appearance, yet internally it can feel seismic. A false self is not simply arrogance or confidence. It is a carefully constructed identity designed to secure approval, avoid rejection, and protect unhealed emotional wounds. Over time, this constructed persona becomes so rehearsed that it feels real. Superiority masks insecurity. Control masks emotional emptiness. When an empath remains present, this structure is reinforced because there is consistent feedback, attention, emotional engagement, even conflict that keeps the performance active. But when the empath withdraws, the performance loses its audience. Without reinforcement, the gap between the projected image and the authentic self becomes harder to ignore. Emotional intelligence teaches that identity built on external validation is inherently unstable because it depends on conditions outside one's control. When those conditions shift, internal fragmentation can occur. The individual may feel restless, agitated, or unusually self-critical without fully understanding why. This discomfort is the psyche recognizing inconsistency between image and reality. At this stage, there is a strong temptation to restore the illusion quickly by seeking new admiration, rewriting the narrative to preserve pride, or minimizing the significance of the loss. Yet beneath these protective reactions lies an opportunity for integration. If the individual chooses reflection over avoidance, they may begin to question long-standing beliefs about worth, power, and vulnerability. They may recognize that dominance is not the same as security, and admiration is not the same as self-respect. Confronting this realization can feel like darkness because it dismantles familiar defenses. However, psychological maturity emerges precisely from this dismantling. When the false self weakens, space opens for authenticity. Authentic identity is not inflated or fragile. It is grounded in self-awareness, accountability, and emotional regulation. The empath's departure, therefore, does not merely expose weakness. It exposes potential. It invites the difficult but transformative process of replacing performance with genuine self-understanding, which is the foundation of lasting emotional strength. Growth through confronting inner darkness is one of the most misunderstood psychological processes because it does not begin with inspiration. It begins with discomfort. When the external source of validation disappears and the constructed identity starts to weaken, an individual stands at a profound internal threshold. The silence that follows is not merely the absence of another person. It is the presence of unprocessed emotion. Feelings that were once projected outward, blame, superiority, criticism, now have nowhere to go. They turn inward, demanding examination. This Ent can either intensify defensiveness or initiate transformation. Emotional development requires the capacity to sit with discomfort without immediately escaping it. Instead of searching for new admiration or rewriting the story to protect pride, true growth begins when a person asks difficult questions. What am I avoiding? Why does this loss feel threatening to my identity? What insecurity lies beneath my need for control? These questions are not attacks on the self. They are invitations to understand it. Psychological resilience is built not by maintaining an image of strength, but by tolerating vulnerability long enough to learn from it. Confronting inner darkness means acknowledging fears of inadequacy, abandonment, or insignificance without allowing those fears to dictate behavior. It means recognizing that emotional dependency on admiration is a substitute for authentic self-worth. When accountability replaces blame and reflection replaces projection, emotional regulation strengthens. Over time, this process reshapes identity from something reactive and externally driven into something stable and internally guided. The departure that once felt like rejection can become redirection, an interruption of patterns that were never sustainable. Darkness, then, is not an enemy but a teacher. It reveals the fractures that need healing and the defenses that need softening. If faced with courage and honesty, this confrontation becomes the foundation of emotional maturity, where confidence is no longer borrowed from others, but built from genuine self-awareness and responsible choice.